Hello friends, how are you? I've been enjoying catching up with some of the tribe leaders this week to hear a little bit more about people who I haven't maybe connected with during this lockdown season. But it has been great to meet up with quite a lot of people through Zoom meetings to pray, worship and talk together over a coffee perhaps. God's organised a couple of surprise meetings in the Tesco's car park when I've coincided at the same time, or a pharmacy queue. And of course now it's beginning to be possible to go and meet up and have chat in people's back gardens or go for a socially distanced walk. And I do hope that most of you, I know some of you are still very much isolated, but I do hope that most of you are able to see face to face, albeit at 2 metres distance, somebody over the next couple of weeks. How are you getting on? It's been a strange 3 months, hasn't it? I know for some people it's been really tough, while for others it's been a time of great blessing as well. I think for me it's been a bit of both of those. But as we look at the culture around us, our society around us, we see all sorts of challenges that are coming upon us which are not going to go away very quickly. Unemployment, businesses failing, the inequalities in our system have really been shown up. The challenges of education and uncertainties for young people starting out in life. How do we live well as the people of God in these strange times? Over the last few weeks, our tribe has been looking at the themes of hope and exile. For anybody who's listening from outside of Antioch, tribes are our small groups, the groups through which we are particularly been connecting, well, probably for many years that have been our main connections within the church, but particularly during lockdown, they've been our main forms of connection as a church. Some of the things that have really struck me as we've been studying hope and exile have been, firstly, that our hope is based not on circumstances and how the circumstances in our lives may change or improve, but our hope is really founded on a person, the person of Jesus Christ and the nature of who God is. As we thought about the idea of being in exile from what our lives as normal used to be, we were asking the question, what does it mean to be the people of God while we are in exile? While we can't get together and worship on a Sunday morning in the way that we used to, what does it mean to be God's people? And what makes us stand out as the people of God in this time of lockdown and exile? Also in the last few weeks, Pete and James have been really encouraging us to look outwards and to share the love that we know in Jesus with the people around us. And I think we've all been thinking about how we can do that within our families, among our friends, with our neighbours. As I've been reflecting on these things and preparing for this week's teaching, I've been thinking about some of the other situations in Scripture that speak to our circumstances. In particular, something that's come to my mind is Paul in prison, writing to the early believers. There are 4 letters in the New Testament that were written by Paul from prison, either in a prison cell or under house arrest. In Rome, in Caesarea, in Ephesus, there's debate about exactly where and when Paul was in prison, but it's likely that he spent about 2.5 years in prison in some way, shape or form. This week we're going to have a look at the letter to the Philippians, and in particular the theme of joy, which is just spread throughout this book, and it really struck me that this is one of the things that the world needs at the moment is joy. And like hope, our joy as Christians is based not in our circumstances, but in the realities of our Christian life and in the realities of our God. So I've asked Sian Thompson to read from Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 to 9, and just sit back and listen to that for a moment now.
Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, Think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you.
Thank you, Sian. That will have been a familiar passage to many, but still it's worth spending some time this week reading, listening, going over that passage again and again to absorb the truths that are within it. What I'm going to do now is just to lead us through the letter to the Philippians, pointing out some of the reasons Paul gives for his joy. And then I'm going to point out some of the ways that Paul suggests in this passage for us also to find and live in that same joy. If we're to share the joy and love of Christ, then we need to know the joy and love of Christ. And this, the Bible, is one of the main places that we can look to learn more about this. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some thoughts on how to pursue this further during the coming week. So, why the joy? In chapter 1, Paul says that he's constantly praying with joy for the believers because he knows that they share the same desire to follow Christ that he does. I can identify with that. It's given me great joy to hear from people across Antioch this week some of the stories of how God's working in and through your lives. Paul's also joyful because he knows that what's happened to him is going to be used by God for the gospel. Have a look at verses 18 and 19 of chapter 1. Paul knows there are all sorts of motives going on and why people are preaching Christ and all sorts of challenges to sharing the good news, but he can see that God's going to use it, and he just has such joy at that. Lockdown and the uncertainties that come with coming out of lockdown might not feel like causes for rejoicing. It can be really tough not knowing what's going on, not being able to plan anything, perhaps not feeling safe, feeling afraid of an unknown future. But Paul has placed his hope in a known future with God. So although he too is in lockdown and he doesn't know when he's coming out of prison, when he can go and visit his friends or have a meal with them, he does have a known future with God, and so he can and does rejoice. Whether he lives or dies, as he says later in the same passage, he's going to be happy. He's going to rejoice. In chapter 2, we see another thing that will give him joy. Unity of the believers. Those believers having the same mind as Jesus and being willing to serve even to the point of death, knowing that there's glory and resurrection beyond that. We can look for that among us as well. Greater unity in local churches. As churches make their offerings available online, we see people sharing their teaching across different churches. Greater unity is the Lectio Divina group that Sue Coleman's been organising, gets together every couple of weeks on WhatsApp, and people from, I can't remember how many different churches it is, but it's 5, 6, maybe more, Sue will correct me, churches in the area getting together to pray, to discover more of God together. Greater unity, but also greater service. How great it's been this week to hear of different ways that people are serving one another. Sian and Elaine with the course they're running on Tuesday and the blessing they're bringing to folk through that. Scott and the Youth Sheds team. Martin with containers being lifted into a car park to help with that earlier in the week. Smaller scale things like people taking food to neighbours, doing the shopping for 3 or 4 folk on a Friday. How Paul would rejoice in those tales of service and unity. Later in this same chapter too, he's rejoicing again. He just loves to hear of and see the believers shining as lights in the world. You know, early in lockdown, James reminded us that we are all, by definition, simply because we have Christ within us, lights to the world. You may not see the impact you're having on your neighbours, but you are shining the light of Christ in their midst. And yes, I know it doesn't always look like that. I spend plenty of time on my knees saying, "Oh Lord, I'm sorry, I wish I'd done that differently." But he rejoices in us and he forgives us. And part of what they see is that we can mess up and still be accepted and loved. There's more joy, but I'm going to leave you to look for it yourself as you read the rest of Philippians this week. And please tell someone else what you find. Pick up the phone, send a WhatsApp message, share the places in Philippians where you see joy in this letter and indeed in your day-to-day life. The main thing I want to point out today is that Paul's joy doesn't come from the circumstances. He's confined to prison, dependent on others for all the basics of life. But his joy is rooted in the glory of what Christ has done in his life and what he sees Jesus doing in the lives of others. He knows he's not perfect and there's masses to learn still. Just look at chapter 3 to see that. But he encourages himself and us to keep going and to keep doing all we can to gain and share all that Christ has to offer. And so we get to chapter 4 and the verses that Sian has read to us all. Chapter 4, verse 4. Here he is again. Rejoice in the Lord. I will say it again. Rejoice. Having given us reasons to rejoice in our fellow believers, in the faith that God will use all of this for good, in our unity and service in the image of Jesus, in all that Christ has done for us, Paul now goes on to give us a couple of really practical things to do to help us to live in that joy and rest in his peace. First of all, he says, when you're worried, tell God about it. Be thankful as you pray. And he promises that God's peace will fill him. Now, I'm someone for whom anxiety has been a huge problem for much of my life, and these verses have at times felt not very helpful, to be honest, when anxiety has caught a hold of my mind. I found it more helpful to focus on remembering that the Lord is near than on praying about the things I'm anxious about. God's brought me through many a season of anxiety, and he continues to deepen my trust in him. Change is possible, and together we can help each other through times when anxiety can make life just too difficult for words. So in the meantime, if you're in that place, get others to pray for you. And also, know that whether you feel like it or not, it is possible, even quite mechanically, to pray, to be thankful, to wait for his healing and his peace, and to know that they will come. But Paul gives us a second thing to do, doesn't he? He says, think about good things. We do have choices as to where we place our attention. Every day, many things clamour for our attention. News on the radio or the TV, social media, the latest show on Netflix, or even the series that you never quite got around to 10 years ago. The YouTube warren of next recommendations that come up on our playlists and draw us down tunnels. It's so easy to get caught up in things that are not necessarily feeding our joy, our love, or our peace. But we do have a choice about where to put our attention. And here Paul is really telling us, make that choice. Focus on what is good, true, noble, and pleasing. Think about these things. That's not to ignore all that's wrong in our world, but to focus on the good things that can bring about change. I don't know if you remember my talk about the disciples on the road to Emmaus. That feels an age ago now. They recognised him because their hearts were burning within them as they talked. Life, joy, love come with good things, and that's where God is, in the good things. That's where our heart burns. We need to learn to recognise the life and the love and the peace and the joy of God in the good things of life. Paul then says, keep on doing the things that you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. You know, many of us in Antioch should be able to write that too. God's led us, taught us, shown us so much over the years, many of us. And we can be doing that for others. We can be teaching, showing, challenging, encouraging one another. And we all also still need to be learning, don't we? So what are the things that you, are learning and receiving and hearing to strengthen the reality of joy, love and peace, all the fruit of the Spirit in us? As I close, I just want to encourage you to dig deep into the scriptures this week and seek out more about joy. I'm going to send out an email with some suggestions on how to do this. And I really encourage you to pick on one or two of those suggestions and get in touch with at least one other fellow believer to explore it together. One well-known verse about joy is in Nehemiah chapter 8, where the people have come back from exile, Jerusalem has been rebuilt, the temple is re-established. They're celebrating, and Nehemiah tells them to go off and carry on celebrating because the joy of the Lord is your strength. We don't know yet when we're going to be back together on a Sunday. We don't know yet when we'll be able to gather in Capel Salon in great numbers. We simply don't know. And it's quite likely that it won't be for a while. But let's go now, today, wherever we are, to celebrate in whatever way is possible for us right now, because the joy of the Lord is our strength, and it is available and accessible to us always. Amen.